Our next speaker is Daniel Schroeter, the Amos S. Deinard Memorial Chair in Jewish History at the University of Minnesota. His works include The Sultan's Jew, Morocco and the Sephardi World, Stanford 2002, and Merchants of Essaouira, Mogador, Urban Society and Imperialism in Southwestern Morocco, 1844-1886. Both books, as I am told, were translated to Arabic and published in Morocco. Unfortunately, as far as I know, they are not translated yet into Hebrew. And like the book we are dealing with, I hope that that will be corrected very soon. He is currently at work on a book with Omar Boum on Morocco and the Holocaust. So please, Professor Schroeter.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and I have to say that I think that there really is some optimism in Ethan Katz's book, and I think we should maybe talk about that a little more. Although certainly in the manner in which he concludes the book, there might be some cause to wonder the different directions I think things can go for sure. And indeed, Ethan concludes his book, or at least begins the concluding chapter in his very compelling book with two shocking events in 2015. The first, the attack on the offices of the magazine Charlie Hebdo and on a kosher supermarket, Hyper Kasher. These events highlighted the violent conflict in which Muslims and Jews were embroiled. For many Jews, it was a frightening example of Muslim hostility to Jews, producing the feeling that life in France was becoming increasingly untenable. Yet, throughout the book, we are reminded that along with the history of conflict and the hardening of boundaries, Jews and Muslims were and continue to be connected, a kind of trans-Mediterranean encounter, I think as he calls it, that is often lost in the dominant narrative of political division and violence. And I think, in a sense, herein lies the optimism also of the book, of possibilities that might invite. I think also there's a kind of paradox that the recent events in France and the growing polarization of the Muslim and Jewish communities and identities exposes, that the intensification and internationalization of both Muslim and Jewish spaces in France that created deep divisions and antagonisms between the two communities, both victims of racism, has also exposed the vulnerability of each community in relationship to France and the French state. This has reinforced their identity as Jews and Muslims as not only antagonistic to each other, but also in creating their sense of otherness vis-a-vis France. One of the responses of Jews to this situation has been to differentiate themselves from Muslims, to reject the very idea that they are immigrants and connected to a common history of colonialism and decolonization. At the same time, there's been another trend among North African Jews to reaffirm their connections to the shared cultural tradition with Muslims. These dilemmas or paradoxes are not new, but are rooted in a history of colonialism and decolonization of North Africa. It is, of course, well known that France is the home to the largest Jewish community or Jewish population in Europe, and the Muslim population in France rivals that of Germany for the largest in Western Europe. The fact that a very large percentage of both Jewish and Muslim populations of France immigrated from North Africa is an important part of this equation and is at the heart of the book. Yet, it is the common context and an entangled historical experience that was shaped by colonialism that is often ignored or rejected in both popular and scholarly writings. It is against the background of France as an imperial nation state in the 20th century and its post-colonial ramifications that Muslim-Jewish relations in France are interpreted in Ethan's book. Relations between Muslims and Jews in France is a subject of much scholarly, popular, and political debate, increasingly polarized by the ideological fault lines of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I have to say that Ethan has also publicly sort of thrown himself into that debate as well. These debates reflect more generally the differing interpretations of Muslim-Jewish relations and a growing literature that focuses on the subject. On the one end of the ideological spectrum, Muslim-Jewish coexistence and reconciliation is all but impossible. From this perspective, Islam, at its very core, is anti-Semitic, and Muslims, as a much larger group in France than Jews, pose a kind of existential threat. A deep gulf, it is believed, exists between these two religious communities, and it is the differences that need to be stressed. Muslims as a kind of unassimilable immigrant group who remain essentially foreign and hostile to Jews, while Jews as a group are well integrated in France, including immigrants who more quickly adapt to French society. This representation of French realities reveals a very deep-rooted anxiety of Jews still being considered as foreigners on French soil more than 2 centuries after emancipation, hence the need to stress the differences for Muslims, indeed to disaggregate Jews from their shared history with Muslims. This ignores the ways in which they both experienced, though differently, colonialism and immigration from North Africa to France. There is a kind of ambivalence or contradiction in this position insofar as many also believe that the future in France for Jews is bleak, not only because of the ever-growing Islamic threat, but because France as a whole is anti-Semitic and has in effect allowed Muslim anti-Semitism to grow out of inertia, a post-colonial guilt that is apologetic towards Islamists, and leftist support for Palestinians, and thus the contradiction. Jews are more integrated than Muslims in France, but because of Muslims, anti-Semitism is alive and well in France, which precludes integration and has compelled many French Jews to emigrate, or perhaps more often, consider aliyah to Israel. There is another tendency, though, I think less dominant than the antagonistic model that I've kind of tried to lay out here, that stresses instead a history of Muslim-Jewish coexistence, of cultural exchange. And the example that Richie mentioned, the account of Sikadur ben Ghabrit, in recent popular accounts about the role of the rector of the Grand Mosque of Paris during the war in saving Jews of North African origin during the Nazi occupation, is representative of this tendency. Both the episode and the public attention that is received in recent years, the relationship between history and memory, is skillfully analyzed by Ethan. In the idealized model, then, colonialism takes a more central place. Peaceful coexistence between Jews and Muslims was undermined by the policy of divide and rule, as Jews became associated or collaborated with the colonial power and had a superior legal status, as we've just heard, by dint of the Crémieux Decree of 1870, when Jews acquired en masse their status as French citizens, a status, of course, denied to Muslims who remained indigenous subjects of France. Vichy and the German occupation reversed this hierarchy between Muslims and Jews, as Jews were stripped of their rights, and again, as we heard in the case of Algeria, of their citizenship. While Muslims were considered to be Aryans, or Aryans of sorts, in any event. The memory of the retelling of the mosque episode thus provides a space for talking about a common identity between Jews and Muslims, both of North African origin, that is largely absent in France of the present. The different interpretations of Muslim-Jewish relations in France also resonate in debates about North Africa, of which the Vichy period highlights. On the one hand, in one type of nostalgic representation of Algeria under Vichy, the abrogation of the Crémieux Decree that caused the Jews to revert back to their indigenous status brought a rediscovery of their common bonds with Muslims, both victims of colonial racism. In Morocco, Jewish leaders in the pre-war years who were endeavoring to escape their indigenous status with the hope of gaining a kind of Crémieux Decree for Morocco were now faced with an even further lowering of their status by the anti-Jewish Vichy laws. As believed by many, the Sultan, in the face of Vichy's racial discrimination, came to the defense of Jews, declaring that there was no difference between his Muslim and Jewish subjects. Well, the Jews reasserted their indigeneity under the aegis of the Islamic sovereign. In France, as Ethan documents, Jews attempted to be recognized or to disguise themselves as Muslims. On the other hand, there is a tendency to look at the period of the Third Reich and the war years as sharpening the divide between Muslims and Jews, as the conflict in Palestine worsened and as Muslim nationalists turned increasingly to Nazi Germany and anti-Semitism, giving rise to the age-old animosity that predated the colonial period. The position of Muslims, of course, as Ethan shows, was far from clear or uniform, and the choices that they made were based on a wide set of circumstances of which anti-Semitism often played a minor role. However, both perspectives, the one of immutable antagonism between Muslims and Jews, the other of harmonious relations undermined by colonialism, though in a sense diametrically opposed, share in common the perception that Jews and Muslims interacted on the basis of their belonging to and identifying with their respective religious and ethnic community. Ethan Katz's work offers a much more nuanced perspective, and with historical depth, as he outlines summarized in his book, it begins with the period of World War I, when both Muslims and Jews fought for France, and World War I lay important foundations for the development of Muslim-Jewish relations in metropolitan France, where in the interwar years, the two communities shared an experience as immigrants and often lived and interacted with each other in the same neighborhoods, notably in Marseille, which was a city with a rapidly growing immigrant population. At the same time, Ethan is not proposing that relations were without tensions, and sometimes events in North Africa, such as again was mentioned, the Constantine riots of 1934, had repercussions across the Mediterranean. For Jews, the riots represented their difference from the Muslim indigène, from the indigenous Muslim population, the latter seen as foreigners as opposed to Jewish French citizens. Yet for Ethan, the story is not only one of conflict, and through interviews and memoirs, he gives a sense of the quotidian life of Muslim-Jewish relations. In this manner, he challenges commonly held views and misconceptions about the ways in which Jews interacted with Muslims historically, rather than seeing the relationship always defined in terms of oppositional religious categories determined by conflict and, as he points out, transnational networks of ethno-religious solidarity. He sees a more complicated and entangled history a common historical experience with colonialism in North Africa, living together and interacting in shared spaces and cultures as ethno-religious minorities, and again, as he pointed out, in a kind of triangular relationship with the state and its and in that sense also, this would include its North African empire as well. How Muslims and Jews did increasingly become defined as separate, oppositional, and hostile religious ethnic groups is analyzed, but Ethan very persuasively argues how these identities were contingent on changing circumstances and contexts, a kind of situational ethnicity, uses the term situational, the contingent and situational are stressed constantly through this correctly, I believe, throughout the book. The tendency of Jews to emphasize their difference from Muslims, of being in a sense more French, has its roots in the colonial period and is a reflection of the power differences and disparities in social status in France. Furthermore, Jewish immigrants were able to integrate more easily to France than Muslims, receiving more help from the state and Jewish communal institutions, and this was a source of tension between the two communities. Political polarization increased also over transnational issues, key periods and events in which differences and tensions increased. The mass migration of North African Jews to Israel and France in the 1950s and 1960s, the Algerian Revolution and decolonization, the 1960 war and its aftermath, and the continued Middle Eastern conflict. Yet, at the same time that Ethan writes about these periods of tension and conflict, there continued to be common spaces and sites of social and cultural interaction. There has, of course, been much discussion now for a number of years of French emigration to Israel, which is often portrayed as being driven by Muslim anti-Semitism and violence that is threatening the Jewish future in France. I think that rarely brought up in this debate is the ethnic component of this immigration, which is, as far as I can determine, largely North African. Although having now been in Tel Aviv for the last half a year, I would say that most people always talk about the French, the French coming or buying buildings in Tel Aviv. You hear a lot of that. But as we learn from Ethan's book, decolonization reshaped French Jewry, and North African Jews became more dominant in French Jewish life. It does seem to me that, seen in this light, emigration to Israel is part of an ongoing process of decolonization, of which the entangled lives of North African Muslims and Jews in the spaces of both coexistence and conflict continue to bridge the Mediterranean. This is an insight, if I am indeed correct in my assessment, that I gained from reading Ethan's book.